know Johnny saw the crashed saucers because he told me himself.
Scary good. These are the stories of a scientist codenamed Professor Panic, who worked in private industry developing impossible machines for the military and government in the 20th century. Much of the technology he helped reverse engineer is still classified. Now in his old age, the professor wants to tell some of his stories about his late friend, a secret agent who we will call Herman Bruland. The professor's story this week begins like this. My late friend Herman Bruland was born in Norway, either in 1929 or maybe 1939. He was a man who liked to drink and who liked to talk. When we would go drinking, he would tell me the tallest of tall tales. In the business we were both in, however, I would never assume the stories were entirely made up. Some nights, Bruland would wax poetic about Marilyn Monroe. It never happened before he'd had at least 5 beers, and it never ended until he'd passed out. He didn't talk about her that often, maybe once every 3 or 4 years. But when he did it as thoroughly and completely and painfully as a ridiculously drunk man has ever done. At the time, I placed these stories solely in the category of fishtales, a bit of bragging after a few drinks. Bruland's stories about Marilyn didn't just seem like he was bragging about supposedly having been with one of Hollywood's most famous stars of all time, but they also told a seemingly impossible story of how he came to work for the company doing the work he did investigating strange occurrences. The impossible and the strange were my business, but Herman's drunken stories of Marilyn Monroe and time travel were a bit too much, even for me. Still, he told me the stories several times over, and this is an entertainment series on YouTube, so I will try to recreate a short version of A Night with Herman when he would speak on this subject. I will omit the drunken parts you will be glad to hear, and I will try to condense wherever possible. I am operating entirely on what I can remember about this, so you'll be getting a reconstruction based on memory of stories that I didn't really believe when they were first told to me. Still, Herman insisted that not only was this all supposedly true, but this is the true story of how he became one of our Men in Black. From this point on, I will be reading in the paraphrased words of my late friend Herman Bruland. As you already know, when my father died in Norway, I was engaged in a feud with him. His unexpected death brought me great guilt and a feeling of a lack of closure. I had left home without permission and come to America after the war when I was 17 and had just achieved citizenship at the age of 19 when I received a letter notifying me of his passing in 1948. Somehow, the loss of my argument with my father took the wind out of my sails and I became rather ordinary for the next bunch of years, wandering around from one factory job to one store job to one construction or sales job after another. There's nothing wrong with that kind of life, but it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing, and I knew that. Without my family or friends in this giant new country, I gave up on thinking of myself as anything special and sank in shame to accept any kind of life other people felt I deserved. And then, one day, the strangest thing possible happened. It was, I guess, 1955 or so. I was around 25 years old. I was walking on 5th Avenue in Manhattan, over by the big library over there, around the corner from the park. Suddenly, I heard someone calling my name.
Herman.
It was a girl's voice, and she sounded somewhat familiar.
Herman.
Turning around, I saw nobody I knew, But I did notice one face I recognized. It was Marilyn Monroe, and she was the one calling me by my name.
Herman, don't you recognize me?
Yes, she had a kerchief over her head, and yes, she was all bundled up, and yes, she had sunglasses on. She was dressed incognito, and nobody else on the block seemed to recognize her. But underneath all that, I could see that it was the famous movie star Marilyn Monroe. Why was she looking at me, and how did she know my name? She walked closer, and then she said the strangest thing.
Oh my, you look so much younger somehow.
I was completely flummoxed, not knowing what to say or do. A woman she had been walking with called out to her impatiently, and so Marilyn kissed me on the forehead and left with her friend. I turned and looked into a store window to see if her lipstick kiss was there. But as she had been traveling in secret, I'm not sure she even had any makeup on at all. Without proof, I actually stood there for a while, staring at my reflection, wondering if that had really just happened, and if it had, what exactly did it mean? So now I had two great regrets in my life. One, that I hadn't made up with my father before his passing, and two, that I didn't get Marilyn Monroe's phone number when she inexplicably knew who I was and kissed me on the forehead. From that day forward, I could no longer regard my life as ordinary, and I found a wanderlust growing inside of me. By 1958, I found myself buying a cheap, used car and heading out west. I wasn't sure where I was going. I just knew it was west of where I had started out. I was hoping I could find some purpose to my life out there, or at least some better paying work. I was driving through the desert as the sun set when it all began. My ears felt funny, as though there had been a change in pressure, kind of like sometimes happens in airplanes or elevators of tall buildings. Things still seemed quiet, but now it was a different kind of quiet. I could see a sliver in the sky off in the distance to my right, which would have been generally northwest of my position. It was a flying saucer, like in the movies, but much larger and wider and flatter. At least, that's what it appeared to be from my angle, out on the desert. There's no place to hide, and I felt very exposed. That apparent flying saucer was too large to possibly actually be real, and I wondered if it were an illusion created by the heat rising off the desert, or maybe I was hallucinating from dehydration. I took a swig of water from the bottle I was carrying with me and poured some more of it on top of my head to cool my brain down. It didn't matter. The craft was still there, floating in the multicolored sunset sky. I was driving as fast as my old pre-owned Studebaker would take me. We were rocking and rolling down the highway, and I was as afraid of the car falling apart at 85 miles an hour as I was about the huge thing in the sky. A thought entered my brain. They've noticed me. I could now see the immense sky disk was moving in my direction. I wanted to cry. I wanted to cry. I wanted to stop the car and run. I wanted to do any number of illogical things. So dominated by fear was I. Now, another voice in my head asked, "Relax." Now, another voice in my head said, "Relax. Your entire life has been leading up to this moment." My life has been leading up to every moment, the human ego shouted back, not wanting to be calmed down. I felt like I was outside of my body, listening to different parts of me argue. From my point of view, I could see that I had no control in this situation, and therefore I relaxed into an observational mode. The flying craft flew directly in front of me on the highway and shone a bright bluish light down underneath it. My car rolled to a halt and turned off, but I don't remember if I intended for that to happen or if it was stopped by some outside force. I expected to be lifted up into the craft, but instead I saw creatures materializing on the road in front of me. They were humanoid, but shorter than the average person. I'm not certain, but I think they might have been young adults or even teenagers. They walked bipedally over to my car window, and I could make out that it was 2 boys and 2 girls. They smiled and seemed friendly and natural. They spoke normal English, but with a slight, strange accent. For some reason, I went into sarcastic mode, maybe out of the self-defense of my sanity. I congratulated them on the show and asked them what planet they were from. "Do you know what time it is?" one of them asked me, looking sincere. I looked at my watch and told him around 12:10. He asked me what date it was. I laughed. "I can tell by your costumes that you already know it's Halloween." None of them seemed to get my joke. "But is it the morning of Halloween or the morning of the next day?" asked the girl as she wiggled over to me in her diving suit. I found myself enjoying that and wondered how I could get her to wiggle closer. "It's the morning of the new day after Halloween, darling," I said to her while winking and smiling. She said something that sounded like a curse, but not one I had heard before. "Say," I asked them, "why are space aliens like you guys so interested in the time? And why aren't your faces green?" "Because we're not from space," answered the guy on the right. "We're from the future, or one possible future anyway." "Oh," I humored him. "Sorry, I didn't recognize your time costumes." "These aren't costumes," said the girl in an annoyed fashion, wiggling a bit closer to the car and setting off dazzling fireworks inside of me in the process. "These are diving suits in case we materialize in water when we travel back in time. Duh." That sounded so ridiculous to me that I suddenly just wanted to get home to bed. "Okay, well, what do I have to do now? Buy Girl Scout cookies?" They explained to me that they were time tripping from one of my possible futures. I asked them exactly how they were doing this, and they showed me a small, brightly colored electric device which did not seem to be plugged into anything. It emitted sounds and blinking lights, sometimes resolving into various written messages or even tiny films being presented, much like Dick Tracy's magical wristwatch. The device was a rectangular slab about the size of a deck of cards, but heavier. "So this is a time machine?" I asked, and they all laughed, indicating that the device was sort of an all-machine, and the time machine was only one of the possible functions of it. In fact, they informed me that they had just enabled the time travel function that day and were experimenting with the device when they encountered me. I asked what time travel cost, and they said it was free but contained, quote, inapt purchases, or perhaps inept purchases. I'm not sure what they were saying, and I don't know what they meant. I couldn't explain how this all had occurred, and I was impressed with the sky show and all, but I was also getting a bit annoyed at being detained against my wishes and wanted these kids to go play their pranks on someone else. "Yeah, sure, you're time traveling using an electric deck of cards. Why don't you guys send me back to 1948 so I can say goodbye to my father?" They looked at each other and sort of shrugged their shoulders, then started poking at the shiny blinking deck of cards machine thing. "Okay, mister," one of the boys said. "Next stop, 1948. Before I could say, "Yeah, right," the person I was talking to was gone. The other 3 were gone too. The flying disc over the road was gone, and so was all the light it had been providing, rendering me a bit blind for a few moments. After a while, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the stars again and my surroundings. I was now entirely alone. I was wondering if I had lost my mind as I drove on toward the West Coast. It wasn't until I read a newspaper over breakfast at a roadside diner the next morning before I realized. It was now 1948. I went into the men's room and looked in the mirror. I still looked the same as I had in 1958. I was 29 years old, but in 1948, I was supposed to be only 19 years old. The other version of me must still exist here too? I was afraid to find out. This seemed a violation of God's law to me at the time, and I admit the room swirled around me. I made a beeline for Hollywood and managed to get myself in with some electricians who got me into the union, and the next thing I knew, I was working in the movies. One day, on the 20th Century Fox studio lots, I saw her. Her hair was kind of reddish, and she looked a lot younger, but it was her. Marilyn, I called out, and she looked my way and waved, but seemed confused. She didn't remember me. Of course not. How could she? She and I wouldn't meet until 1955. 1955! The year when Marilyn Monroe treated me like an old friend on the streets of New York City. If she thought we were friends, then maybe this was when we became friends in 1948. The last time we met, she remembered me, but I didn't remember her. Now, the shoe was on the other foot. I suddenly felt more sure of myself than I had ever before. Surely this was fate. She wanted to know how I knew her name, and I said I loved her in Scudda-hoo, Scudda-hey. She was most impressed that I had seen that, since she wasn't scheduled to be acting in it for another 2 weeks. Plus, she only had a little part, so she knew I was full of what makes the grass grow and just trying to get her to date me. And so she did. We had a brief but torrid affair until the studio broke us up. They didn't think it would help her image to be seen as the girlfriend of an electrician, since they were grooming her for bigger things.
Herman, you know I love you. You're my first Norwegian.
I was heartbroken, but still the same, I really had no right to complain. Marilyn reminded me that movie star careers and contracts don't last forever, and that maybe our paths would cross again. So we went our separate ways. It was soon after that when I met Agent X, the man who realized I was from the future and who recruited me to work for our corporation. Since then, I've remained in this timeline, aging in the normal way. I've adopted a new identity since then and never met or interfered with the younger, other version of myself. I wonder if he, too, traveled back in time when he was 29. Or did his life take another path? There are too many bad stories about doppelgangers for me to want to try to find out what would happen if we should ever meet. Now, as you know, I have a few friends in our organization who I have shared these secrets with, besides yourself. One of them got in touch with me privately in 1962 and asked me to reacquaint myself with Marilyn for the purposes of extracting information from her concerning the President of the United States and possible alien technology. At first, I laughed that my coworker thought the President of the United States would entrust information about alien life to a movie star, but he insisted that this was a distinct possibility, and he was asking me to please either prove or disprove this theory. If there were any truth to the stories, I was to find out where the alien visitations had originated from. It was surprisingly easy to reach Marilyn's people, and using my old name, to get an appointment to meet her for lunch. She met me at a lovely seafood restaurant overlooking the water, and we talked and reminisced and drank and drank and drank. Then she took me back to her place, and we talked about more private things, including gossip about both Kennedy brothers, Jack and Bobby. When she seemed loose enough, I asked the questions I'd been sent there to ask her. Marilyn, I saw a flying saucer once. Do you think the President knows anything more about flying saucers or space aliens than the rest of us know? Did he see them?
I know Johnny saw the crashed saucers because he told me himself.
What did they look like? Does he know where they came from?
No, they don't know where they came from. They just recovered them. At least that's all they told him.
She related a lot of other mind-blowing information, but none of it was related to issues concerning our company, so I neglected to make note of any of it. Let's just say she was a woman who lived an interesting life. It was more than good to see her again, and I was sad when it came time to go.
Goodbye, Herman. Remember, I will always love you.
Come back for more scary stories.